So welcome everybody. It's 26th of May, 10:04 Central European Time. Welcome to this session on nature-based solutions and the road to net zero, defining quality and responsible use within hard-to-abate sectors. This is one of the workshops in this amazing conference organized by the World Bank and IDON Innovative for Climate. It's an incredible program. I was going through the different sessions today, and I think I put a star pretty much on everything. So don't forget that actually all the sessions are available also later on. So you know, spread the news. There's a lot of really rich content. So I'm Giulia Carbone, the director of the Natural Climate Solutions Alliance, which is a platform co-hosted by the World Business Council for Sustainable Development and the World Economic Forum. We bring together businesses that are interested in investing in natural climate solution carbon credits and NGOs and solution providers to really understand together what are the quality criteria for natural climate solutions. So solutions that build on nature conservation, restoration and better use of land, but also deliver biodiversity gains and benefits for people. So today we are really discussing a really specific issue. We're looking at basically how in the hard-to-abate sectors, natural climate solution can play a role. So I'll be just your host and moderator, but the discussion is really building on 3 stars that we have today, and thank you so much for joining us. We have Frances Seymour from the World Resource Institute, Mark Henber from the Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative, and Flora Jean from Shell. So they will speak about their experience, their point of view, and then we will have hopefully some time for questions from the audience. And then, as I said, you can always contact us later for further, discussions, and you can rewatch this and other sessions. So without further ado, I will start having a conversation with our 3 speakers. And I'd like to start with Frances. So our focus is really on the use of natural climate solutions in the voluntary carbon market, but it is important to understand the context. So really the question is, why engaging hard-to-abate sectors in the voluntary carbon market is key if we want to stay below 1.5 degree increase temperature? Frances, you're on mute.
2 years after the pandemic, still forgetting. Okay, thanks, Julia, and thanks for organizing this panel on a really important topic. Look, by definition, hard-to-abate sectors are likely to have unabated emissions in the near term, even while they're doing everything they could, according to the mitigation hierarchy, to reduce the emissions that are possible to reduce now, and even while investing in developing and commercializing new technologies that are going to be necessary for the future. And at the same time, companies are increasingly being encouraged to undertake what's now called beyond value chain mitigation actions. In other words, investing in mitigation outside of their own value chains to counterbalance those unabated emissions on the pathway to net zero. And one of the options for beyond value chain mitigation is purchasing high quality carbon credits. Now, the science is clear that we need steep emissions reductions from all sectors in order to meet the Paris goals. And there's something of an alignment between the near-term inability of hard-to-abate sectors to reduce their own emissions as quickly as other sectors can, and on the other hand, the urgent need for finance elsewhere in that same near term. Now, my own focus and the focus of this session is on nature-based solutions, and for me, especially forests, where there's an urgent need for financial incentives to protect the world's remaining natural carbon stores. Many of those, particularly tropical forests and peatlands, the carbon in them is irrecoverable in the relevant time frame. And at least for forests, we need to halt and reverse deforestation in the next 8 years to have a chance of meeting the Paris goals. So to many of us, it makes sense for companies in sectors, say, such as aviation, to counterbalance those unabated emissions in the near term by financing high quality emissions reductions and removals outside their value chains, even while they continue to do everything that they can to reduce their own emissions as quickly as possible and to invest in the new technologies that will get us away from fossil fuels in the future.
Thank you, Francis. But then the question is, what should be the conditions, or should there be conditions for investing in the voluntary carbon market for hard to abate sectors? And I would say maybe not just hard to abate sectors, basically. So what are these credits now, especially compared to what we used to call offset in the past?
Really important to get this out on the table early. It's critical to understand that we are not talking about the use of credits as offsets in the traditional sense of that term. These are not your father's offsets, because offsets are commonly understood to be substituting for emissions that could and should be.
Please try a call later.
Sorry, I'm getting some noise.
Yeah.
Offsets are commonly understood to be substituting for emissions that can and should be reduced, but offsetting just provides a cheaper and easier alternative. And that kind of offsetting would delay the needed reductions that we need, across all sectors. So what we're talking about is a both-and approach that actually enhances mitigation action compared to the alternative. So in order to make any credible claims regarded to the purchase of carbon credits, companies need to have set and be progressing toward a science-based target to reduce their own emissions, and publicly report on that progress using the GHG protocol, and report on any role that carbon credits play in their corporate net zero strategy. In addition, companies need to not only refrain from lobbying against progressive climate policy, but become proactive advocates of that proactive climate policy. In other words, there needs to be coherence in the corporate mitigation strategy. Now, I should note here that the NCS Alliance was actually ahead of the game in getting started on wrestling with some of these difficult issues well before initiatives such as the VCMI got off the ground. And for me and other colleagues at WRI, those discussions were a really useful learning experience to understand the differences among corporate and NGO perspectives on these issues, and really attempt to see if there was any common ground that we could reach. And within WRI, over the last 3 years, we've reached a sort of a collective view on what constitutes demand side and supply side guardrails, by the way, for credible use of MBS credits in the voluntary carbon market. And it's going to be posted as a technical perspective on the WRI website in the coming days. It's entitled Guidance on Voluntary Use of Nature-Based Solution Carbon Credits through 2040, and the lead author is David Burns.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much. We're looking forward to that. And thank you for, definitely the NCS Alliance was really actively involved in creating that kind of consensus between NGOs and businesses. And as you said, they came with different perspectives, but they came to a common position, which is so powerful, I think, to say as a shared position, or what does it mean to, invest with integrity. We were talking about exactly the guardrails, and I think, Mark, this is a nice way to introduce you and the work that VCMI is doing, because you're working on claims, and I think these questions of guardrails, people will say, okay, so what do I do once I do everything, in the right order and to the right amount, like Francis was talking about? How can we use claim into this picture of going beyond value chain and trying to get more companies to invest in the voluntary carbon market?
Thank you, Julia, and thank you to you and the NCSA for inviting me here today. And also thank you to Francis for having laid out with remarkable clarity what's likely to come out in the VCMI guidance on June the 7th. So that's fantastic. And I think, first, I just want to emphasize the point that Francis made, that a lot of people who see me, you, and others working around voluntary carbon markets think that we are facilitating a get out of jail free card for people who don't want to take action. Yeah. And I think Francis said it very clearly. The use of voluntary use of carbon credits is in addition to, not a substitute for corporate action at source. And the VCMI guidance is designed to, one, provide clear guidelines for companies about when and how they should make use of carbon credits, whether those be NBS or other kinds of carbon credits. And the second part is what they should be able to say about it. And those are obviously linked. And the second part is what you're referring to in terms of claims, Julia. And I think why it's important there are a number of reasons. One is, like any normal human being, if you've done something that goes beyond the call of duty, beyond what you're required to do, you want to tell people about it. Yeah. And so this provides a way for people credibly to shout from the rooftops about what they've done. And if you have really got on your science-aligned pathway for scopes 1, 2, and 3, and then you compensate even a small, but preferably a large chunk of your remaining emissions, you've invested a fair amount of money and a fair amount of resource in that. And you should be proud of it, and we should be recognizing it, provided it is the compensation or the use of carbon credits is above and beyond you meeting your obligations or your commitments. The second part of the claims is linked, but I, for example, was on a call with a company the other day, a food producer, who has a product in a supermarket that they want to call carbon neutral. Well, we can dispute whether the name is the right one or not, but they have, for that product, they have reduced their emissions year on year for a decade. They're continuing to invest in new technologies, in new product formulations, and they want in the supermarket to be able to market that as a carbon neutral product. There is a very similar product on the same, just down the aisle on the same level of shelf, which uses the same carbon neutral claim and has gone back to what Francis referred to as your father's offsets. They've basically done nothing, bought a bunch of cheap carbon credits from some bloke down the pub, and they're claiming carbon neutral. And so the first company is going to go, why? What's the point? Why do I make all this effort, go above and beyond, really do what I'm supposed to, if I'm going to be undercut by someone else? So a second part of the reason for having claims or verified claims is so that over time, consumers, the general public, can distinguish the wheat from the chaff, can distinguish what's really gone the extra mile and what hasn't. So part of the work of our claims guidance is to provide the basis, we hope, for governments and regulators as they look at upgrading consumer protection regulations, advertising regulations, all those things that affect all of us as customers, as consumers, so that we're able to make the right choices. And the consequence of all that is, we hope, and from the consultations we've done so far, that companies, once they feel that they can be comfortable with making claims about their activity, both decarbonisation and use of carbon credits, that they're not going to get taken down in public because they are tarred with the same brush as a whole bunch of other people who are doing the wrong thing, or because they haven't had clear guidance to follow. Then that will encourage them not only to do their decarbonisation, but also to invest in voluntary carbon markets, in particular in nature-based solutions.
Thank you, Mark. And yes, you didn't mention the word business case, but yes, definitely having the claims is gonna, become, credible claims and something that can be verified independently, and and allow companies then to use, in a way, to shout out saying we are doing it better, is such an important element to drive then more companies to do it. So we really hope this is gonna materialize fast. Flora, we talked about the hard to abate sectors, what they need to do in terms of getting ready or getting to the point where they can invest in a credible way into the voluntary carbon market, this basically space that is called now beyond value chain mitigation. You work for Shell, which is oil and gas, and also increasingly renewable energy. But let's talk about the oil and gas. What do you think is basically the situation today for the oil and gas sector, that they want to demonstrate that they are taking the journey to net zero seriously, and they're taking their, the necessary steps to get there? What is the framework? What is the context for your specific sector?
Yeah, thank you very much, Julia, for having me. And I just want to really also thank Mark and Francis for their sharing. I fully recognize the importance of the quality and integrity discussion. This is not only about supply quality, supply integrity, but also about demand and responsible use of carbon credits in line with the mitigation hierarchy, precisely above and beyond the commitment, credible actions to demonstrate the avoidance and reduction before we using carbon credits offsetting in our value chain. Indeed, as you said, Julia, I work in Shell in oil and gas industry. I definitely recognize and strongly feel the challenges and the pressure this industry is facing today. As you see what happened this week, and also I would say for a long period of time about Shell in the market, it expressed a very deep anxiety people have around climate change and real actions to move towards energy transition and to lower and zero carbon emissions eventually. So what's going on in the industry today? I mean, there has been ongoing assessment if this industry have a scientific-based emission methodology to really define what can be reduced, what can be avoided, and what can be eventually offset. But SBTi has been working on the development of a standard for target setting since 2019, but this has been delayed and there is no further clarity on when it can be completed. And I have to say this lack of widely accepted methodology is leading to a significant differences in disclosure from different companies. And there is no alignment on the common approach for companies to, let's say, take to set targets to reduce greenhouse emissions and limit global warming in line with the UN Paris Agreement stretch ambition. So I do feel we really need to find a credible methodology and form the public consensus for oil and gas industry. I really hope we can make it work. Without that, I'm worried that, you know, this industry will just not have that kind of aligned approach, which leads to all sorts of issues about mitigation hierarchy discussion, responsible use discussion, and so on and so forth. But beyond that, to address your second question, what shall we do to really transform towards net zero? So I genuinely feel there will not be one single solution. We need to work on a series of energy solutions and try to make them work in a holistic view. So from Shell perspective, we set our net zero ambition to reach to net zero emission business by 2050. And we defined that by 2030, our absolute emission from scope 1 and 2 operational activities need to be halved, literally reduced by 50%. And there are also other milestones identified along the value chain. And what we try to do is really to firstly avoid emissions from our direct operations, but also invest and shift our portfolio towards renewables, lower to zero carbon emission products, and jointly work with hard to abate sectors like aviation, road transport, maritime, etc., to decarbonize these sectors from demand perspective. It will take time. It's not going to be straightforward. There is one single solution. But I do feel, you know, energy transition is about really accelerate the pace, and it's going to require lots of collaborations from many different parties, including government, civil society, and also commercial organizations.
Thank you, Flora, and thank you for, you know, coming out and talking about this. I know it's not easy for the oil and gas sector to be, you know, to come and share the views. And I think often we talk about renewable energy and the importance of investing, but as you said, it's not the only solution for the energy transition, because we can't just focus on electricity. There are going to be a lot of other solutions that need to be taken. But Mark, back to you, because I think also the issue of claims. So how are you designing the claims based on, you know, I know there were a piece related really to the integrity of the demand. So how are you going to address the integrity of the demand for sectors that don't have the luxury of having a recognized standard, such as, you know, right now we all talk about SBTi. So how is, you know, how's VCMI, I mean, the claim guidance addressing the oil and gas sector challenge?
So, so specifically on the oil and gas sector, I should just make it clear that the VCMI code of practice or provisional code of practice doesn't distinguish between sectors. It doesn't say these sectors can, these sectors can't. If you are a company from any sector and you meet the prerequisites, which are, as Francis probably laid out, you've got an inventory, a public inventory, you've got a target, a long-term commitment, short-term targets, we're agnostic as to the sector. Now, we do recommend, we say, set your interim targets and net zero commitment using SBTi guidance or equivalent. And the reason for equivalent is not specifically because of the lack of guidance for the oil and gas sector, but there are, as we know from the I4C, there are many different pathways for the world to get to net zero, and there are going to be very many different pathways for companies to make their fair share contribution to that. So our view is that if you can set a net zero commitment and you can set interim targets that are consistent with achieving that, and you can have those independently verified, and they're in the public domain, so they're open to scrutiny, open to people questioning them, then that is good enough. And you know, people should be aware, and as I'm sure Flora certainly is, that they will be scrutinized, and all company plans do get scrutinized, and that's absolutely right and proper. So we don't make any distinction across sectors, and we are hoping that our work will encourage, whether it's SBTI or others, to develop credible guidance that works for the oil and gas sector and for other sectors that aren't currently covered. The one area where it's probably just worth mentioning that there has been quite a lot of dispute or discussion is that the main part of the VCMI code of practice focuses on claims at the company level, at the enterprise as a whole. But obviously, as I mentioned earlier, and a lot of you will be aware, there are a lot of products, brands, and services that look to make some kind of claim independent of what the company as a whole doing. And obviously, one of the problems with that is if the holding company or the company itself is doing nothing and causing all sorts of problems, it's completely inappropriate for it to have a carbon neutral this, that, or the other, or a net zero aligned product. So our requirements there is that the company as a whole must meet all those prerequisites that Francis mentioned, that must have a science aligned target, a net zero commitment, must have an inventory, must be doing all the right things at the corporate level. And then at the product level must also take into account full scope 1, 2, and 3 life cycle emissions, everything you would expect if that product or brand was a company. Now, why I mentioned that this has been contentious is that some people, not a majority, but some people have said that all products that are by their very nature damaging to the climate, of course, which would include oil, gas, coal, and others, but maybe many others as well, should not be included. Now, we've reserved judgment on that because there was no absolute consensus, but we will be going out for consultation over the summer, and I have no doubt that it's an area where people will comment one way or the other, whether there should be specific exclusions. So I myself am going to sit firmly on the fence on that if you ask me any more questions about it, but that is an area where there has been some debate, shall we say.
Thank you, Mark. Actually, maybe this is a good time for reminding people, the audience, we have around 110 participants. What is the timeline and where they can find information on the consultation? Because that I'm sure a lot of people will be interested in providing input. And Daisy, maybe you can drop something in the chat. The consultation starts when?
Starts on June the 7th. We're publishing the provisional code of practice on June the 7th. That will be a public consultation that will last for around 2 months. Also, if there are any companies on this participating in this session, we're looking for companies either publicly or private to road test the code of practice itself, because it's got to be both environmentally sound and robust, but it's also got to work. And if companies can't use it because it's too complicated or too expensive or comes out with the wrong answers, then we haven't served our purpose either. So if you're a company, please do get in touch. All the information is on the VCMI website.
Excellent. Thank you, Mark. So let's talk about the other part of the discussion, which is the one that is really close to everybody's heart. We work on natural climate solutions. So then I'll start again with you, Francis. So we talked about the high quality of NCS, right? And this magical, mythical NCS. Could you just tell us a little bit more about what do we mean by natural climate solutions and why we feel like we have to always to mention high quality and put that, prefix, and why is so important?
Sure, Julia, and I remembered to unmute myself. So natural climate solutions, are those that really depend on the natural functions of nature to sequester and store carbon from the atmosphere. And so, different people draw the boundaries in various ways. Some people focus natural climate solutions just on mitigation, but I think we also should have an inclusive definition that includes the value of natural climate solutions for adaptation, because many, perhaps all ecosystems, in addition to interventions that enhance the mitigation capacity, end emissions or enhanced removals also enhance the functions that are important for adaptation. So that broad category of natural climate solutions. In terms of what we mean by, the second part of your question was, why do we have to focus particularly on this? Unfortunately, natural climate solutions have a bit of a taint in the market that dates back to the CDM era, when there were concerns that because of measurement difficulties, for example, this was before the era of satellite monitoring of forests, that it was not going to be possible to quantify those emissions reductions and removals with sufficient certainty to, have them welcome into the carbon markets on the same terms as other carbon credits. But I think over the last 15 years, the technology has really completely revolutionized, as well as the various tools and methodologies that have been developed to reduce risk. So I really do think that natural climate solutions should be considered on par with solutions from other sectors. So in terms of what constitutes high quality, it just so happens that a few days ago, a coalition of non-governmental organizations and indigenous peoples organizations published a guide specifically targeted at companies that were considering the purchase of tropical forest carbon credits in particular. And that guide, in fact, was launched during a session of this conference on Tuesday. I think we can put a link to the guide in the chat, and I'd be happy to answer the questions later on. But in brief, by high quality, we mean credits that meet the high standards of both environmental integrity and social integrity. So environmental integrity means that the emission reductions or the removals that are the basis for the credits are real. They're not just hot air. And that the risk of leakage, impermanence, uncertainty of measurement, other kinds of risks to the quantification of those emission reductions or removals are appropriately managed and issued in a conservative way. And that natural ecosystems are unharmed in the process or even enhanced. Social integrity means that those interventions to produce the credits certainly do no harm to indigenous peoples and local communities, to women, to laborers, other vulnerable groups. But it also means that those interventions proactively seek out and promote the achievement of other sustainable development benefits, and do so with the active participation and leadership of those affected stakeholder groups. So it's not just a do no harm standard, but a partnership and do as much good as you can kind of standard. So the guide that I mentioned earlier details guidance in the form of 5 recommendations. And the first of those 5 recommendations is actually related to the demand side guardrails that we were just discussing, and sort of sets a threshold for what companies need to be doing to make any claims against the purchase of tropical forest carbon credits. There's another recommendation specific to the environmental and social integrity standards that I just outlined. But I'd say we give special emphasis to the importance of respecting the rights and roles of indigenous peoples and local communities, because they are especially affected by the natural climate solutions and are probably best positioned to ensure that those solutions are effective in their territories or local communities. In addition, the guide recommends that companies use their demand signal to shift crediting in ways that enhance quality of the overall supply on the market. And in particular, a shift in demand from credits from isolated standalone projects to jurisdictional scale programs and projects nested within those programs at the scale of entire countries or subnational jurisdictions such as states and provinces. Because our sense is that not only does that help ensure the accounting integrity and align with the framework, the Warsaw framework under the Paris Agreement, but it incentivizes the kind of transformation in land sector management that is going to be necessary to solve this overall problem. The other 2 recommendations in the guide quickly are one regarding giving a priority to emission reductions over removals in the near term, just because of the urgency of ending the conversion of natural systems that I alluded to at the beginning of this session. And while we refrain from giving detailed guidance on claims, we do ask that companies align their reporting with the accounting requirements of the Paris Agreement so as to manage the risk of double claiming. So let me stop there. Thanks.
Oh, thank you, Francis. This is excellent. And it's a really, I mean, I had a look earlier, and it's really practical and gives a lot of very, very actionable recommendations that companies can start integrating into their procurement processes. So again, the investors will play a huge role. Unfortunately, today we can't speak about investors, but actually I was just in Davos the past 3 days, and the discussion of the role of the quality of the investors came up so many times, you know, the patience and resilience and the requirements. So maybe next year we should have a session on what is the ideal investor. So back to you, Mark. So we were talking about demand, you know, how do we, you know, we have the guy rails, let's assume that they have, you know, the investors, or especially those companies that are purchasing to retire have all this guy rail in place. How do you think the claim can help increase, you know, the demand? And specifically the demand for natural climate solutions? Is it something that you're working on or planning to work on? But in general, you know, how much do you think we have to work on mobilizing the demand?
So I think you come at that from a couple of angles. I mean, over the last 5 years in particular, there has been a huge shift within the voluntary carbon market, which up until about 5 years ago was dominated by credits generated from renewable energy projects. And those have, to a large extent, by the major standards, particularly in middle-income countries, large grid-connected renewables projects are now no longer accepted. So that's meant that suppliers have to shift elsewhere. And one big consequence of that is the vast majority of new projects and new credits issued in the voluntary carbon market do come from the land and forest sector. So we're already seeing a shift there. I think that's further burgeoned by the growing interest by companies of wanting to be contributing to nature-based solutions. There's a, you know, we've seen the large number of commitments around COP26 around nature and deforestation. This is seen whether for sort of genuine climate or nature protection reasons, or because it's a nice thing to put on the cover of your corporate sustainability report. Forest protection and similar projects are becoming more and more attractive. Within the VCMI code of practice, we don't distinguish between what kind of credits companies should be using. We're not against that. One of the bits of feedback was, or two bits of feedback. One is, if a credit is of high quality, then it's high quality regardless where it comes from. And second, that the work that, for example, the Integrity Council on the voluntary carbon market and others are doing, create labels or tags so that buyers can clearly identify whether a project comes from forest protection or some other area. So that's something that makes it easier for companies to know what they're buying and to choose without having to do huge amounts of due diligence. All of that said, and as I've mentioned to you separately, Julia, we would be very interested in exploring if there is demand for a claim that focuses specifically on contribution to protecting nature and tropical forests in particular. The reason we haven't got that so far, apart from the work that's been done on the supply side, is anyone who's seen previous iterations of our guidance would have seen that there were more claims and more potential claims than there were fingers on both my hands. And a lot of the feedback we had was, no, you've got to make this simple. If you're going to make it credible and it's robust, it's got to be simple. Yeah. So don't make too many distinctions. So that's where we are now. But there is appetite. There has been some feedback that people might want to be able to say, not that we're net zero aligned or carbon neutral, but that we are nature positive, as some companies already do. And should that be incorporated into the same guidance? So what people see on June the 7th won't include that, but that's certainly something that we're interested in working on over the coming months and years.
Yeah, no, thank you, Mark. And just wanted to clarify that my question was a bit of a trick question, but is far from me from thinking that this is a simple endeavor to add that element of, you know, positive contribution to nature, because we all know that the complexity is not just related to what you're going to measure to define that. also, I'm still not very clear what is nature positive from a business perspective. We know what it means from nature perspective, but the contribution of a business is a different story. So, but I think it's an opportunity not to be missed to have that conversation and see how far we can move, because first of all, the nature and climate piece need to come together as much as possible. And we cannot afford to, maybe try to win the climate without winning the nature battle. But then on this, Flora, tell me something. I mean, Shell is really invested and investing in natural climate solutions. Why, and tell us a little bit more about what exactly you're doing as a company. What is the role of NCS specifically? And yeah, over to you.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Julia. Maybe a little bit history, right, of the journey we have been through. The first time Shell Executive Board started to talk about nature-based solutions, natural climate solutions, was about 9 years ago. So the conversation dated back then. We were looking into the nature space and how to really link this to potential activities we as a company can pursue. But then what really changed the thing was back to 2017. After many scientific studies reveal that nature actually can contribute more than 1/3 of the requirements towards Paris Agreement by 2030. So Shell made the decision to seriously make firm commitment to nature-based solutions and set up our organization to work into the investment of protection, enhancement, and restoration of various natural ecosystems. In the beginning, we were more focused on the forestry part, but now today we diversify this to agriculture, grassland, wetland, and also coastal ecosystems. So what we do, I really want to echo what Francis mentioned. From our perspective, it has been a learning journey, to be honest, because NCS is not a traditional area Shell as a company is very familiar with. So we work with many government bodies, but also, let's say, the academic and scientific institutes, NGOs, and social enterprises trying to really improve our understanding and how to really work on high quality, high integrity NBS investments. So our learning curve have been through a pathway to really enter to the 4 buckets. One is about climate, and then it's also about nature, community, and economy. And we try to find a fine balance, the harmony way in between of these 4 elements. Climate part is more linked to carbon, but then nature is really about environmental ethics, biodiversity, water, air quality, flood risk management, etc. Community, this really goes back to Francis' point about the social integrity. We want to make sure whatever project we do, we really try to tackle the local requirements from the indigenous group or local communities and design the fit for purpose community program for them. And we also started to pilot the benefit sharing mechanism in our projects. And that is literally the recognition of the philosophy that the ultimate beneficiary of these projects need to be the local communities and the hosting government. So how do we actually make sure the profit will be allocated to them along the journey, especially if carbon price keeps going up? So that is in a nutshell what we do today. And then it comes to the point, how do we really commercialize this business? Because we run it as a business, not as a social investment per se. So from that perspective, it's about the business model we try to navigate. So today, for the carbon credits we generate, we use these primarily for scope 3 hard to abate emissions in line with the avoid, reduce, and then offset mitigation hierarchy. So you will see programs we run like in retail station or lubricant products. We bundle our credits with energy products we produce and offer this as an option to our customers so they can choose if they would like to offset. We also have many collaborations with B2B customers, understand their decarbonization strategy, their net zero pathway, and identify where offset will play a role and how to make sure it is responsible use of these carbon offsettings. So eventually for me, why Shell as a company want to do this? You see, in the beginning, it's more focused on our traditional value chain. But over time, when we started to work on NBS, we also add the respecting nature and powering local lives into our Powering Progress strategy in 2021. So along this journey is really about how to make sure there will be no harm and there would be net positive impact to these NBS projects we work on. This is the status quo as of today. But I would say along the journey, what's more important is also to make sure for our other parts of the business, we also make sure there would be integrated NBS approach into the project activities we do. So something we started to work on since last year, we committed to net positive impact to biodiversity and to nature. And we're still trying to figure out how to really demonstrate a credible pathway towards these ambitions. And if I may, the last point I would say is really about, quality of credits, integrity of program, and responsible use. For me, these are the three foundations to have legitimacy for a company like Shell to operate in the NBS space. And that is, I and my team are really working very hard on daily basis. Yeah.
Thank you, Flora. We are not yet taking questions, but there was a question about, if you can refer to a case study of the method that, what you're actually talking about. There was a case study of the method used as Flora suggested. So I guess it's more about, like if you can be more specific of where exactly you're, working on these projects. And maybe if you have a place on that we can share if on your portal where people can go to learn more about the specific investments in NBS is all on your
sure
website.
So in the Shell website there is an NBS session. So in the NBS session we provided a few examples of the projects we're running today, and if the audience is interested in more details, I'm more than happy to share more offline. In a nutshell, today we have around 95 projects across the globe. Majority of them sit in Australia. These are more the carbon farming projects we run, around 65 projects across 10 million hectares. We have joint venture in China running reforestation, afforestation projects, a dozen of these scattered around the western part of the country and northern eastern part of the country. We also support projects in Africa like Zambia. There are also programs in India and also in other Latin American countries. Very happy to share more offline.
Yeah, thank you, Flora. And I think another important point is to understand when we are talking about natural climate solutions, that these are not infrastructures that you can build like, you have instructions and you build them. Each project is unique and that there is a lot to learn and a lot of time that needs to be invested to get them to, to really work and deliver all the positive impacts they're supposed to deliver. So early investment is really important. I take that as you want to work and use this, the credits also to help your consumers compensate for their emissions. You're going to work with Mark.
Yes,
and provide
absolutely.
input on how to use his claims. But then one last point to all, is the voluntary carbon market the only way we should look at to finance and to support natural climate solutions? Maybe Francis, I'll start with you. Is this, this match of climate and therefore finance in nature is really important, because we know nature has been under support, financially. The finance flow to nature is really a small portion of what it should be. So that's why there is all this, enthusiasm from the conservation community in this specific flow of funding. But is it the real way? Is it the only way, or we should think out of the box, thinking about what we were talking about claims before with Mark?
I think there's two answers to that question. First of all, it can't be the only way, because there are certain needs that are inappropriate to be financed, through a market-based mechanism, right? So we still need development assistance finance for capacity building. Philanthropies can play an important role in providing independent support, to help, for example, indigenous and local communities, make informed decisions about whether they want to participate in this arena, at all, and that sort of thing. But I think what you're getting at is, might there be other sources of market finance for the nature-based solutions agenda? And I think that there may be, but they require other things to happen. For example, I'm aware of a decade's worth of effort to mobilize green finance to fund, sustainable investments in the land sector, but they tend to struggle to get started because often the policy, the enabling environment doesn't exist. And as long as your competitor can illegally cut the forest to, plant some, commodity, you're planting that commodity in a more expensive way, to meet a deforestation-free commitment is not going to be a viable business proposition, right? So you sort of need to level the playing field up to, reward businesses that are, investing in more sustainable practices. The other is to think about creating new tradable assets like, biodiversity, units or other creative things. And I'm aware that, people are trying to do this. My concern is that, it's taken us 15 years to build the infrastructure for, say, forest carbon finance, and we've got 8 years left to end deforestation. So do we really think that we're gonna create, new assets and create demand for them in the relevant time frame to deliver the finance at scale that we know we need? So is the voluntary carbon market the ideal source of finance? Of course not. But I think that given the balance of risk, and let's be clear, all of this is about balancing different kinds of risks. The risks associated with mobilizing some of that finance for this urgent need, in my view, reasonable people can disagree, are less than the risks of no action or depending on something that's, a little less certain to deliver the needed finance, given that we've only got 8 years left to solve the problem.
Thank you. Thank you, Francis. Flora, you're from the perspective of a company that is invested both in climate mitigation and biodiversity.
Yeah, indeed. So I'm not sure if this is the only way, but I do believe this can be a very valid and scalable way for private sectors to contribute to these very important and very urgent challenges. There are multiple benefits in doing so. And from my perspective, why private sectors can tap into voluntary carbon market to, do investment and to really work on the responsible use of credits is also because private sectors, corporates like Shell, we bring long-term commitment into these projects. It's not like a 5 years duration, 10 years duration. All the projects Shell MBS has invested into really around 2 decades, 3 decades. It's a serious long-term commitment we bring to the local communities. We will be with them along this journey, make sure there would be sustainable alternative livelihood and nature will be genuinely protected or enhanced or restored. And we also bring, sectors can bring different kind of commercial solution, innovation, technology to make this scalable and materialize over time. Because for me, climate change, natural climate solution, it requires scale and materiality. A little bit pot here and there, we only have 8 years to solve deforestation. It doesn't work. It requires a much scalable approach and also solution. That's why I'm also very passionate about the jurisdictional approach as well.
Yeah, thank you. Mark,
I echo what others have said. I think we should, when we think about the voluntary carbon market, we should take as a starting point that the fact that we're still talking about the voluntary carbon market, and I've said this many times before in 2022, is an indication of our abject failure over the last 30 years to address climate change. We've known about this when international negotiations started in 1989. So it's been 30 plus years, and yet emissions are still rising. Tropical forests are still disappearing. So the voluntary carbon market exists because we haven't managed to do anything better. And it's a bit of a damning testament to our collective inability to solve these problems. That said, I think the voluntary carbon market can play an important role over the next few years, but it cannot and must not be the only way we try and address either nature loss, loss of tropical forests, or climate change in general. If we're still having this conversation in 15 years' time, then we're in a really sad place. So I think we need to think about, one, other kinds of beyond value chain mitigation that don't require ton for ton accounting. What are other things that Shell and other companies could be doing that don't require them to match emissions, but it's just, this is part of either a corporate commitment or a corporate obligation? Could it be something that is a semi-voluntary becoming mandatory requirement by governments of their companies? We need to think about how we recognize that beyond value chain activities in a way that's not obviously easy to do, because we're used to counting tons of carbon, but there are other ways of doing it. It could be money, it could be volumes of areas of forest protected. So we need to think about that. We need to think about how the voluntary carbon market not only delivers all the things that we've discussed so far, but how does it feed into policy so it makes policy more likely rather than less likely? And that's something I think those of us on this call and others need to work together to think about, because the fact that we're depending on something that has the word voluntary in its title gives a clue to the fact that it can't be the only or the best way of solving our problems.
Yeah, no, thank you. And unfortunately, we have to leave. So, but this was very useful. In one word, if we had, there are plenty of things that we can fix, but let's focus on, the fact that we have to move forward. But let's say as a priority, what would be a priority of things that we need to fix? Frances, why don't you, sorry, I'll start with Flora, actually. Flora, what would be the most important thing for you that will help progress this investment?
If I have to choose one, I would just choose the quality of credits first. There are so many credits in the market today. They're not real quality credits. It will jeopardize the credibility of the voluntary carbon market. I really want to make sure we have a common standard, the minimum threshold to solve this.
Okay, thank you. Frances.
It's definitely more clarity on beyond value chain mitigation, including what discrimination there should be both on the demand side and on the supply side. For example, on the supply side, some companies have misunderstood SBTi net zero guidance to mean that only removals count toward BVCM, leading to a focus on tree planting at the expense of protecting the forests we still have. So we need to clear that up. And on the demand side, we need to discuss how the expectations for beyond value chain mitigation might vary across sectors. Because for some companies, counterbalancing their unabated emissions would be a modest investment, but for other companies, it would be a much heavier lift.
Yeah, thank you. And Mark.
Well, I would echo what Frances has just said, and I think adoption of consistent, coherent rules across the board on both the supply and the demand side, so that those who are investing genuinely can do that with confidence, and those who are, well, I can't think of a polite way of saying it, not doing it genuinely, are kicked out of the market because they're being scrutinized properly, and that means transparency.
Thank you. Thank you all. I know we are running 2 minutes late, so not much time to follow up on other things, but the amazing, really incredible contribution, Frances, Flora, Mark, it's direct, and I think I've seen some of the comments from the audience. It was really appreciated to have this conversation on really important issues and so direct. Anybody who wants to know more about the NCS Alliance, you can also follow us on LinkedIn, NCS, look for NCS Alliance and follow us. And we'll be in touch, and next year we can talk about the progress made in the next 12 months. But it's urgent to take action. So let's move on quickly. Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you all.
Yeah, thank you, Julia. Thanks, everyone.